Mr. Kutz, you mentioned one of your discussions was the question of misleading advertising or marketing or assurances to parents. Last night and early this morning, I was on the internet and sort of scooting around some of these sites, and it's a very seductive introduction to parents who are distraught, who are stressed, who have been dealing with this maybe for multiple years. They generally list a series of problems that children have: bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, drug and substance abuse of all different segmented, a number of different ways, ADD, I'm trying to count, and the suggestion is that the staff can deal with all of these. Any one of those is a career for a professional. And all of my work in mental health and my wife's work in mental health and involvement with kids and the idea that you can just insert a problem and this counselor can take care of any number of these problems in an effective way is, I haven't seen it practiced that way except in these representations, the suggestion that they are trained, effective counselors for each one for these disorders. And of course, most parents in this situation would identify with one or more on that list. And I just wondered if you might address that.
Yeah, and I can speak to the 10 cases in depth, but the parents were pretty much told what they wanted to hear. As you said, it almost didn't matter what the circumstances were for the child. The programs were purported to be experts for those kids, and it went far beyond that. You had cases where you had no one that knew CPR in the entire program. You know, just something basic like that, where you're having kids out in the wilderness or at a boot camp or whatever, and no one knows CPR. So I think, and they marketed to the desperate parents. You heard these parents today. I mean, they were in a desperate situation. They were looking for something, and they were probably vulnerable at the time. I don't want to speak for them, but I think they probably were. I'm a father. I could see how that could happen. And I just think what you mentioned earlier, what the parents mentioned here for parents looking today is buyer beware. Buyer beware. I mean, these are programs that, especially where there are unregulated programs in certain states, you really don't know what you're getting. Could I go back to the criminal also? The fact that there were not a lot of criminal prosecutions and documented evidence that the people that are dealing in these programs have a background. When parents are doing due diligence on these programs, an interesting point here is how do they know that some of the people who were involved in the abuses and the cases that we talked about here aren't dealing in the current programs today? The answer is they won't know. And so it's a very difficult environment out there for parents.
Could you elaborate on the Thayer case, number 10, in the 10th case in your item?
Yes, and that's the most recent case from Missouri. Yeah, that was a case where I mentioned that was one where we believe that there was certainly abuse. And I read the autopsy report myself in depth twice, and I really couldn't believe it, actually. I mean, this kid had bruises, abrasions, and kind of signs of abuse from head to toe, from his head down to the bottom of his legs. And there was reports that he had been dragged around, and the other kids at the program had been forced to drag him around when he was unable to exercise. And I mentioned to you in the opening statement that when he was unable to exercise, then the penalty was not medical treatment, but to put a 20-pound sandbag around his neck and make him wear it around. So that is a case of absolutely clear abuse in my judgment.
You know, Ms. Pinto made the point, and I think it probably strikes all of us here. Had any parent engaged in any of this behavior against a child, they'd be in jail. Almost any singular incident of numerous incidents and ongoing activities against these children, a parent, a school teacher, a coach, they would all be gone. And I'll get into it later because I've got a second round of questioning here, but you know, my concern is that these people sort of reinvent themselves. They leave Nevada, they show up in Oregon, they leave this program, they rename themselves. I've followed some of these programs now longer than it took to cross the West by walking. I mean, you know, these people constantly are morphing themselves, and your point is you don't know who's quote, counseling your kid, whether there's criminal behavior, whether they've got their own problems. But, you know, one of the things that stuns me is the marketing of the wilderness and the outdoors and nature, and then to take people into the outdoors and the wilderness and nature and brutalize them in the name of the nature. I don't get it. I've backpacked for 30 years. I was on a trip this weekend on the high rims above Lake Tahoe in the aftermath of a snowstorm. And in that trip, we must have stopped 6 or 7 times and checked everybody on, saying, are we okay? Can you proceed? Do you think we should go back? We're this many hours into it. We got this many hours of daylight. Is everybody drinking water? Is everybody snacking? Because we're burning a lot of energy because it's really cold. And for 30 years, I've hiked in that fashion with kids. I've had kids come into our camp in the middle of the night on different wilderness programs, but all of them were schooled in how to deal with the program. They were all given challenges, massive hikes, really quite stunning what they accomplished, with a guide, with full education, with the dangers of how to take care of yourself, how to respond, how to handle the worst, and then the challenge is laid out. And I kind of understand that. I can see why that's used as a tool. But the idea that you take a person and you have her walk out in 100-degree weather, and somehow this is good for you, and nobody's paying attention to dehydration, nobody's paying in the name of the wilderness that this is therapeutic. No, this is abuse. And back to your point on mismarketing. It's a wonderful thing for parents to think, geez, maybe get my kid out of this neighborhood and we can start over, and they can go out there and they'll be fishing and they'll be swimming and they'll be doing all these things. It is just outrageous that they would suggest that somehow you can have a positive outcome with these children by using the outdoor experience as an abusive action against children. It's just stunning to me, and it's contrary to any norm of anybody who's been out in those situations, especially when you have young people with you in terms of learning about the outdoors. And this whole marketing, I mean, as I went on these websites one after another, and then when you look at the cost